面白い。
Hello everybody and welcome to this video. We're not actually looking at a single game this time around. We're not looking at one single title. We're going to talk about a general topic. It's a topic that's of a great deal of interest to me. I hope you find this video interesting as well. And I'm doing this video because one of our regular viewers actually asked me to, I guess because I do cover a lot of fan servicey games both on digitally-downloaded.net and this here YouTube channel. Obviously I enjoyed my fan service a great deal, but with that comes a series of questions, I guess, that people talk about quite a bit in relation to video games and fan service, and that's the topic of exploitation. And I guess the questions that people tend to ask is, firstly, whether exploitation is a thing in video games, whether it's something that we need to discuss, and if so, where we draw certain lines over what is acceptable or what is appropriate and what is not, and when things go too far. So this video I'm going to explore that topic a bit and try to come up with some answers, I guess. It is something that I have touched on in the past in some of the written stuff that I've done for digitally-downloaded.net, but I haven't actually done a video on it, so hopefully this becomes a video that I can reference back a bit in the future and contributes, I guess, in a healthy way to the discussion around this topic, because I think that there's an awful lot of, for want of a better word, hysterics that go on about this topic, and I think people tend to have knee-jerk reactions to things, and I don't necessarily think that's necessarily healthy for the video game industry. I don't think it actually contributes in any meaningful way to the discourse. So hopefully this comes across as I guess, a more rationed take, or a more reasoned take, a more thoughtful take, whatever you want to call it. Hopefully it's something that gets you thinking and not just reacting. So I want to start this video by having a discussion, I guess, from a historical point of view, and just make the point that what we determine to be exploitative today, or what we think of as exploitation, changes, and over time artworks that were once exploitative become less so, or works that were not looked at in that way, I guess, start to take on a different edge, depending on the culture at the time, depending on society, depending on how things have developed in the world. So an example that I like to give when thinking about this in particular is Degas. Now, Degas was a painter of the 18th century, a very well-known one. If you've ever studied the visual arts on any level, you will know who Degas is. He was an impressionist, a French impressionist, and one of the real pioneers of that particular artistic movement, and he was very well respected, and he is very well respected to this day. You can go along to galleries and they'll often hold Degas exhibitions where people pay plenty of money just to go and see Degas' work. And Degas' most famous work had to do with the way he depicted ballet dancers, ballerinas. He had a great fascination for the ballet and painted a whole series of paintings that show ballet dancers behind stage. It was always off stage doing their warm-ups and all of that kind of stuff. And today we look at those paintings as being quite elegant examples of the impressionist genre, and we don't see anything untoward within them. They seem very innocent and very elegant and very beautiful, and so on and so forth. We don't see anything in those paintings because, you know, these days ballet isn't really thought of in terms of exploitation. But back when Degas was actually painting these things, it was a very different matter. Ballet was an interlude between the real art, opera, so people would go along to operas, and then during the break they'd get a bit of a ballet to watch, and those ballets were, for want of a better word, there to give people a look at girls' legs, really. Ballet was a very low-class kind of art form back in those days, and ballet dancers were typically glorified prostitutes that have a sponsor, and that sponsor would demand things of them in return for funding their ballet dancing and stuff. So back then, when Degas was painting the ballet dancers, people would have looked at those paintings and thought something very different to what we think of when we look at those paintings today. And that goes to show you the way that this discussion evolves. What was once considered to be quite exploitative in tone, in terms of the way it depicts people, characters, that can change, and I think that will happen with video games as well. A lot of the stuff that we look at today as being exploitative in nature will, a couple of decades from now, not be seen as such. And we actually kind of already see that to an extent when we look at a game like Tomb Raider or a character like Lara Croft. Back when Lara Croft was first revealed to the world, back in her early games, she was very much dismissed as a purely exploitative character. I mean, those triangular boobs were, well, they look ridiculous now, but back then they caused a bit of a stir for the way they depicted sexuality within the game. But fast forward even just a couple of decades to today, and Lara Croft is seen as a very different kind of character. We see her as somebody quite strong, even with the large chest and the way that she wears, you know, body-hugging clothing and all that kind of stuff. There's been a lot of work that's been done to legitimize her as a strong character above and beyond the sexuality, and the sexuality is something that Lara Croft now owns within her games and is seen as quite a strong female character. So it does change. What is exploitative now won't be a couple of decades from now. I guess the main question that people tend to ask about this topic, though, is whether it is worth talking about at all. There are a lot of people that would suggest it's kind of not. It's a non-issue. It's a topic that doesn't bear thinking about. I would suggest that it probably is worth talking about, because in talking about it we do get to discuss how characters are depicted, how characters can be both strong and sexy, how characters can represent certain themes, and how we can respond to them, and how that can affect the way that the game's story is told and all that. And I think it's a positive thing. I think having strong, sexy women in video games is, well, it's certainly the kinds of characters I like to play. Nier Automata, Tomb Raider, which I mentioned before, the Dead or Alive girls, they're all quite strong characters. And the developers have managed to still make them quite sexy and stuff like that, but they've done it in a way that maintains their strength and would, I mean, people would always argue that some of these characters are exploitative anyway, but I would find none of them to be particularly exploitative. So I think it's a discussion that is definitely worth having. I think the historical background, you know, shows that this is a discussion that will never go away anyway, even if you personally don't think it's worth talking about. It's been happening for centuries, so it's not going to stop. And I guess having an idea of how to engage with it is a good thing, and that's, I guess, what this video is looking to do. So where do we draw the line in this day and age? What do we determine to be exploitative at this particular moment in history, where we, you know, talking about it as new game releases and stuff like that? I look at the topic in two ways, or I guess I have two questions that I ask myself as to whether a game is exploitative. And the first is whether the character has agency. And that's really important to me, I think, as somebody who has always grown up reading books and had a very literary background in terms of the way that I look at art in general. For me, having that sense of agency in a character is really important in determining whether that character is a character that the plot focuses on, or a character that the plot is using. And agency means that they are not controlled by other people, other agents in the game. Agency means that they are making their own decisions within the scope of the narrative. And for that reason, and this is a game that everybody always discusses when it comes to exploitation, for that reason I think that Dead or Alive is not really exploitative, because if you look at it, all the characters in that game have agency, and they are all quite strong and independent and well and truly capable of looking after themselves and defending themselves and standing up for themselves. And this is actually particularly true for the women characters. The main character of Dead or Alive has always been a woman in Kasumi, and each of the other women characters have come along. You've got Tina, who ran for president, or at least wanted to run for president. You know, she is a very strong woman, despite her feminine assets. You've got Nico, which was introduced in Dead or Alive 6, and she's a scientist, and therefore, you know, she's a very intelligent person. And that contrasts a bit to the male characters like Zach, who's this doofus, and Brad, you know, Brad, who drinks himself to sleep every night. You know, the male characters tend to be a little bit more stereotypical, if anything. They tend to be a little bit more of a exploitation in the way that they're kind of presented for humour, and they're made use of as characters for humour, whereas the women characters are the ones that are portrayed as quite strong, the focus of the narrative, and within that narrative have the agency. So from that perspective, I don't think we could call Dead or Alive exploitative. The other question I tend to ask myself is whether the fan service or the sex content as such serves a narrative point, whether it's there for a particular reason to further a particular theme that the creator is putting into their work, or is in their work, whether the creator really intended it or not, to quote Death of the Author. And that's important too, because if there's a particular reason for it, if there's some kind of subversion going on, if there's a particular point that the creator is making using the sex content, it's not really exploitative, or at least if it is, it's not in the context of a negative as we generally use the word, because it's got a specific reason for being, and whether you agree with that or not is rather irrelevant. What is the point is that it's not just there for the sake of being there. And there are some great examples of that. I mean, in literature, the Marquis de Sade is the perfect example for me. His work is basically pornographic in nature, but every single time his work is there as kind of in a revolutionary spirit, and he uses the sex content and the pornography to really further that revolutionary spirit in his work. It's there to show the hypocrisy of the church or the ruling elite, or all of that kind of stuff. And during the French Revolution, when de Sade was working, that was really important. It was really important that he was exploring that anger against the establishment through his work. And yes, it was shocking and all of that kind of stuff, but that's the kind of point. He wanted to shock you because what the elites were doing was shocking, and sometimes you need that. So the exploitation within probably the most famous pornographer of all time actually serves a point, and therefore I would suggest that even if you still want to call it exploitation, it's not a bad thing. Of course, in video games, we don't quite have a Marquis de Sade to call on to really show the the greatest strength of using exploitation for a particular theme or topic. But there are plenty of examples within the video game genre of people or creators using exploitation to make a point. So, I mean, a great example is Yoko Taro with Nier Automata. 2B is a very exploited character. She's a very fan servicey character, and Yoko Taro was out there actually encouraging people to draw all kinds of fan art involving her. But again, he was using that within the context of showing certain things about humanity and showing certain traits and showing, I guess, in the context of his game, the way I read it anyway, there's all kinds of ways you can read Nier Automata, but the way I read it was that he was making a point about the treatment of beauty within the context of humanity, because 2B, being not human, being an android, was obviously created in the mold of humanity, and that is Yoko Taro's statement about what is beautiful in the world. Another example is Goichi Suda is a great example, because a lot of his work is quite transgressive and subversive, and Lollipop Chainsaw, which is my favourite game of Goichi Suda's, was roundly criticised for being exploitative, because the main character was a cheerleader in a very short skirt, and you were actually encouraged to tilt the camera down to try and look up that skirt. There was a trophy in it if you did that. So his game was immediately criticized for being exploitative, but as you played it, in fact, if you played it for more than a couple of minutes, you realize that he was really turning all of that stuff up on its, he was turning it upside down, because Juliet, which was the cheerleader, was actually a Buffy-like character, very powerful, very strong. She was very intelligent, where her boyfriend was a literal head on a belt in the game, and he was basically your horny teenager type. Juliet was the one that could talk multiple languages, was the one out there saving the world. So the exploitation of her as a cheerleader character really built into that subversion. And I guess that kind of goes to, the writer of Lollipop Chainsaw was actually James Gunn, who was the director of Guardians of the Galaxy and its sequel, and I think everybody knows now that guy's capacity for kind of subverting, I guess, traditional gender roles within entertainment, and he certainly did that with Lollipop Chainsaw. So again, that was an example of a game which has exploitation in it, but used it for a particular point. Therefore, I would question whether you would really want to call it exploitation in that negative light. There were plenty of examples as well of games that use exploitation as part of a homage to a particular art movement. The good example here is Schoolgirl Zombie Hunter or Oninchambara, or pretty much any of those kind of B-grade, deliberately trash games that have a lot of exploitation in them. They're always a callback to the sexploitation film movement or the grindhouse film movement, and within the context of that kind of cinema tradition and that homage to a kind of cinema that we've actually lost, they work, they further something, they create an aesthetic and a drive that really pushes the game beyond just a raw kind of TNA experience. So again, I think that if a game is a homage to a classic form of art, which is not above criticism by any means, and was certainly exploitative itself, that's why it was called sexploitation, but it was art, it was a movement, it was an entire genre of cinema for a very long time. To create a homage to that it's quite noble, really, I find it to be, because it's preserving that heritage and that tradition and finding ways to modernize it and give us a look about how it might look in this day and age. So I don't consider that to be exploitative in the negative sense either. I think that's quite a positive thing, and that applies to a lot of games. A lot of games from kind of B-grade developers that you might come across, and people tend to again dismiss them because they've got swimsuits and stuff. One final game I wanted to mention as an example of this kind of using exploitation for a point and therefore is not exploitation would be Blue Reflection. And there's a little bit of Blue Reflection in the video footage that you're watching here in front of you and stuff. Blue Reflection was a game that was fairly robustly criticized for being exploitative when it was out, principally because it does feature schoolgirls in a school setting and bath scenes and shower scenes and pool scenes and all of that kind of stuff. So on the surface of things, yes, you could say it is exploitative in a way that makes people uncomfortable, and fair enough. But on the other hand, it is a coming-of-age story, and it tells quite a sweet and subtle story about a person coming to age, growing up, realizing her place in the world, realizing her limitations, her strengths, and all of that kind of stuff. And the developers have quite clearly not flinched from any of it. They've tried to show a kind of slice of life look at every aspect of that coming of age experience, and that does include the stuff that people dismissed as being exploitative. So I don't feel like it's an appropriate thing to criticize the game for that as well. Maybe note that it's there, and maybe comment on it, and feel free for it to make you uncomfortable if you so wish. But to suggest that the game is the lesser for having it in there, or that the game has crossed some kind of line, I think is going a little bit far. As for games crossing that line into places where they shouldn't be, I mean, everybody does have their own line and their own center and their own sense of what they find acceptable, and I don't want to dismiss anybody's line. I don't want to suggest that anybody is wrong for where they've drawn that line. My personal line is to when the fan service doesn't add anything to the game, when it's just there for the sake of being there. It happens a lot when games try to be comedic in style, when games try to aim for the hilarity, when they try and be funny, but don't have that sense of social satire in them. That's where I find it to be unnecessary, and as it is unnecessary, I find it both distracting within the context of the game and a kind of negative. I don't find it particularly enjoyable in those cases. It doesn't actually happen that often. I think, especially in the modern era, especially with the way that things are now, developers know that that's a strong line for a lot of people, even people who are quite happy with fan service usually. And I think that there aren't too many examples of games that cross that line. So that's for me where the limit is as such. Other than that, though, I think that a lot of games that are fan servicey in nature get drawn up as being exploitative without actually necessarily being so. Okay, that was a long ramble of a video. I appreciate it if you've managed to sit through and listen to it all. I hope it was interesting. It is a bit of a brain dump, and it was way off script, so I don't even know if I've made any sense when I've said this stuff. But I hope there was some nuggets in there that were interesting or thought-provoking, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. So, of course, drop in and let me know what you think. Let me know what games you think are good examples of fan service that are not exploitative. Let me know what you think are good examples of games that have fan service and are exploitative. I'd be very keen to get the debate going, but of course I do ask you be civil. That is just a given. Other than that, please do back me on Patreon if you like my videos. Doing these kinds of things is so much easier if there's that vote of confidence and that kind of monetary support, because time is money, and keeping these kinds of things going, it's just that much easier if I'm able to make a little bit of money on the side out of it. So thank you. If you do enjoy my videos and you do back me on Patreon, thank you very much. Otherwise, we will be back at the next one. In the meantime, please do go read digitallydownloaded.net. I might as well put a plug in for the website as well while I've got a couple of seconds. Digitallydownloaded.net, we update 3, 4, 5 times per day, so there's an awful lot of news, reviews and opinions that go in there. And it's meant, this YouTube video was always meant, this YouTube channel was always meant to be a complement to the site. So, you know, for the full DDNet experience, please do check out the website. Other than that, we will be back for the next video, hopefully not too long from now. Thank you.
And we'll also need some sort of cutting tool. Why don't you look around?